There's a stretch of road in northern Appalachia that doesn't appear on any map made after 1957. If you ask the locals about it, they'll tell you it was reclaimed by the forest. If you press them, they'll tell you to leave it alone, and if you keep asking, they'll stop talking to you altogether. But the road is still there, overgrown, yes, forgotten, deliberately, and the people who used to live along it didn't just move away, they vanished. All of them. In a single autumn weekend in 1956, an entire network of families simply ceased to exist in the public record. No death certificates, no forwarding addresses, no missing persons reports that were ever taken seriously. Just silence, and a county clerk who decades later would confess on his deathbed that he'd been paid to lose the files. This is the story of Marrow Creek. Not the town, there was never a town. Marrow Creek was a bloodline, a web of families connected by marriage, land, and something else. Something that kept them isolated on those unnamed roads for nearly a century. The outside world knew them only as the people who didn't come down from the hills. The families who sold nothing, bought little, and kept their children out of schools. They weren't Amish. They weren't a religious commune. They were something older than that. Something that predated the churches and the laws and the tidy American story we tell ourselves about how communities form and why they dissolve. What happened to them wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragedy in the way we use that word to make sense of senseless things. It was an ending that had been prepared for, rehearsed even, and the few people who know the truth, the descendants who got out before that final autumn. The county officials who were ordered to forget, they'll tell you the same thing if you can get them to talk at all. They'll tell you that Marrow Creek didn't vanish. It completed. And that's so much worse than disappearing, because completion means it was always heading toward that moment. Every birth, every marriage, every child raised in those houses along those roads, all of it was in service of something that was finally, after generations, ready to be fed. We're going to follow those roads tonight. Not physically, you couldn't find them now even if you tried, but through the records that survived, through the testimonies that were buried, through the photographs that were never supposed to leave the archives. And by the end, you'll understand why some roads are meant to be forgotten, and why forgetting them might be the only mercy we have left. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The first written record of Marrow Creek appears in 1847 in the private journal of a circuit preacher named Josiah Wendell. He wrote about encountering a settlement of families living in a hollow so remote that even the Cherokee scouts he'd hired refused to take him all the way in. Wendell went alone. He described houses built in a perfect circle around a clearing. 13 houses. No church, no meeting hall. Just those 13 structures, and in the center of the clearing, a stone foundation that he said looked older than anything else in the region. Older than the houses. Older, he wrote, than the trees. He stayed for 3 days trying to minister to them, and in his journal, he recorded something that would echo through every account that came after. He wrote that the families were kind to him, fed him well, and listened politely to his sermons. But on the third morning, the eldest woman in the settlement, he called her mother Tallis, took him aside and told him they didn't need salvation because they'd already been promised to something else. And that promise, she said, was older than Christ and would outlast his kingdoms. Wendell left that morning. He never returned. And in the margins of that journal entry, in handwriting that's noticeably shakier than the rest of his careful script, he wrote 9 words. I saw the children's faces in the stone. He never explained what he meant. The journal was found in a church archive in 1981, and the historian who discovered it tried to track down any record of the families Wendell had visited. She found nothing. No land deeds, no tax records. Nothing until 1889 when a county surveyor named Dalton Cray filed a report about an unauthorized settlement in the back country. He listed 13 family names: Tallis, Rourke, Drummel, Vess, Stroud, Morn, Pitch, Caro, Sowell, Harrow, Bent, and Marrow. 13 families, same number of houses Wendell had described 40 years earlier. Cray's report recommended the families be forcibly relocated or taxed into compliance with county jurisdiction. The recommendation was denied without explanation. Someone, somewhere in the bureaucracy, had decided to leave them alone. And for the next 67 years, that's exactly what happened. Marrow Creek existed in a legal gray space. They weren't citizens in any meaningful sense. Their children weren't registered. Their dead weren't recorded. But every few years, someone from the outside would encounter them. A hunter who got lost, a trapper passing through. And they'd all say the same thing. The people were polite but cold. The houses were immaculate but wrong somehow. And there were always children, more children than you'd expect. Too many children, all of them silent, all of them watching. In 1923, A social worker named Margaret Hollis was sent by the state to investigate rumors of child neglect in the backcountry settlements. Her assignment included Marrow Creek, though the county office couldn't give her clear directions on how to reach it. She had to hire a local guide, an old man named Prout who'd grown up in the area. He took her as far as the tree line, then refused to go further. He told her she'd find the road if she kept walking north, and that she'd know it when she saw it because the trees around it didn't grow right. Margaret wrote in her report that she thought he was being superstitious, but when she found the road an hour later, she understood what he meant. The trees on either side were bent inward, their branches reaching toward the center of the path, like hands trying to grab something. She followed the road for 2 miles before she reached the first house. She spent 4 days among the families of Marrow Creek. Her report, filed with the state in November of that year, is one of the most detailed accounts we have of life in the settlement. She described the houses as clean and well-maintained, the families as self-sufficient and orderly. The children were homeschooled, taught by the elder women of each household. They grew their own food, raised livestock, made their own clothes. On the surface, Margaret wrote, they seemed like any other rural community trying to preserve a traditional way of life, but there were details that disturbed her. The children never played. She never saw them laugh or run or engage in any kind of spontaneous activity. They moved through their chores with mechanical precision, always in groups, always silent. And when she tried to speak with them directly, they would look to the nearest adult before answering, as if they needed permission to form thoughts. The adults were more forthcoming, but their answers felt rehearsed. When Margaret asked about their isolation, they told her they preferred to live away from the corruption of modern society. When she asked about education, they insisted their children were being taught everything they needed to know. And when she asked why there were no men between the ages of 20 and 40 in any of the households, they told her the men were working in the deep woods and wouldn't return until winter. She noted in her report that she never saw any evidence of forestry work. No tools, no lumber, no wagons or horses for transport, just the 13 houses and the clearing in the center and that old stone foundation that no one would explain. On her last day there, one of the younger women, a girl barely 20, pulled Margaret aside and begged her to take her away. She said she was supposed to be married soon and that she didn't want to go through with it. When Margaret asked who she was supposed to marry, the girl started crying and said a name that Margaret couldn't understand. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language Margaret recognized, and before the girl could explain further, 2 of the elder women appeared and led her away. Margaret left that afternoon. In her report, she recommended that the state conduct a full investigation into the settlement and that social services monitor the welfare of the children. Her report was filed and forgotten. No investigation ever took place, and when Margaret tried to follow up 6 months later, she was told by her supervisor that Marrow Creek had been reclassified as outside state jurisdiction and that she was to drop the matter entirely. She retired from social work in 1925. In 1968, 2 years before her death, she gave an interview to a local historian in which she said that not a week had gone by in 45 years that she didn't think about that girl's face, and that she was certain, absolutely certain, that whatever was supposed to happen to her had happened, because Margaret had failed to save her. By the 1940s, Marrow Creek had become something of an open secret in the region. People knew the families were there, they knew where the roads were, even if those roads didn't have names, and they knew not to go there unless absolutely necessary. But the war changed things. Men from the surrounding counties were drafted, and the federal government needed to account for every able-bodied male in the region. In 1943, a draft officer named Lieutenant Paul Hendricks was sent to enumerate the households in the backcountry areas that had been previously overlooked. Marrow Creek was on his list. He arrived in late September with 2 county deputies and a translator, though no one could explain why a translator would be necessary for an English-speaking settlement. Hendricks kept a personal diary of his visits, and the entries about Marrow Creek are disturbing in their clarity. He wrote that when they arrived, the families were expecting them. Not in the sense that they'd been warned someone was coming, but in the sense that they'd prepared for this exact visit. The eldest members of each household were waiting in the clearing, standing in a line in front of that stone foundation. Hendricks noted that there were 13 people in the line, 1 from each family, all women, all over the age of 60, and all of them holding ledgers, handwritten books that contained the names, birth dates, and lineages of every person who had ever been born into the Marrow Creek families going back, according to the eldest woman, to 1761. Hendricks wrote that the ledgers were immaculate, every entry in perfect script, every date accounted for, every marriage recorded. He took down the information he needed for the draft and noted that there were 43 males of eligible age currently living in the settlement. When he asked to speak with them, he was told they were working in the deep woods and wouldn't return for several weeks. Hendricks didn't push the issue. He got what he came for and left. But in his diary, he wrote something that he clearly struggled to articulate. He said that while he was copying names from the ledgers, he noticed something about the birth dates. Every single child born into Marrow Creek shared a birth month with their mother. Not just the same season or roughly the same time of year, but the exact month. Every daughter born in the same month her mother had been born. Every son born in the same month as his father, without exception. And when he looked further back in the ledgers, he saw the pattern continued for generations. He asked one of the women about it, and she smiled at him and said it was a blessing, that their bloodline was aligned with the cycles of the earth in ways that outsiders couldn't understand. Hendricks wrote that her smile was the most frightening thing he'd ever seen. Not because it was cruel or mocking, but because it was genuine. She believed what she was saying. And in that moment, Hendricks understood that whatever Marrow Creek was, it wasn't a community in any normal sense. It was a machine, a biological and spiritual machine that had been running for over a century, and every person born into it was a component in something larger and infinitely more patient than any human institution. None of the men from Marrow Creek were ever drafted. Hendricks submitted his report, but when the draft notices were sent out in early 1944, the names from Marrow Creek weren't included. Someone in the chain of command had removed them, and when Hendricks tried to follow up, he was reassigned to a desk job in Washington and told to stop asking questions. He died in 1979, and among his personal effects was a single photograph he'd taken during his visit to Marrow Creek. It shows the 13 women standing in front of the stone foundation. And if you look closely at the photograph, you can see something carved into the surface of the stone behind them, symbols. Not letters, not numbers, but shapes that seem to shift depending on how the light hits them. The photograph is now held in a private collection, and the owner refuses to allow it to be published or studied. He says that everyone who's looked at it too long has reported the same thing. That the longer you stare at those symbols, the more you become convinced that they're not carved into the stone. They're moving under it, breathing. The end came in October of 1956. Or rather, that's when the outside world realized something had ended. The last confirmed sighting of anyone from Marrow Creek alive was on October 12th, when a postal carrier named Douglas Smith drove past the entrance to their road and saw smoke rising from the clearing. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was autumn. People burned brush. But 3 weeks later, when a hunting party stumbled onto the settlement, they found it abandoned. Not destroyed, not ransacked. Abandoned in a way that suggested the departure had been orderly and planned. The houses were empty but clean. Beds were made. Dishes were washed and stacked. Livestock had been released from their pens. And in the center of the clearing, the stone foundation was gone. Not broken apart or buried. Gone. Where it had stood for over a century, there was now a perfectly circular depression in the earth, approximately 8 feet deep and 30 feet across. The soil inside the depression was black and loose, and when the hunters tried to dig into it, they found it went down much further than 8 feet. One of them tied a rope to a tree and lowered himself into the hole with a flashlight. He got 20 feet down before the rope snapped and he fell. The others pulled him out, and he refused to speak about what he'd seen at the bottom. He left the area that night and never returned. He died by suicide in 1961, and in his suicide note he wrote only one sentence: "It's still waiting and it knows my name." The county sent investigators, but they found nothing conclusive. No bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of where over 200 people had gone. The 13 houses were eventually torn down, and the land was left to return to wilderness. The roads were deliberately allowed to overgrow, and within a decade, you couldn't find the site unless you knew exactly where to look. But there were rumors. There have always been rumors. People in the surrounding counties started reporting strange occurrences in the years following the disappearance. Children waking up in the middle of the night speaking in languages their parents didn't recognize. Families finding symbols carved into the trees around their property. Symbols that matched the ones in Hendricks' photograph, and there were the dreams. Dozens of people, unconnected to each other, all reporting the same dream. They're walking down a dirt road that bends inward through twisted trees. At the end of the road is a clearing. In the clearing are 13 houses arranged in a circle, and in the center, where the stone foundation used to be, there's a hole, and something in the hole is singing. A low rhythmic sound that isn't quite music and isn't quite language. And in the dream, they know they're supposed to walk to the edge of that hole and look down. But they also know that if they do, they'll see faces, hundreds of faces, all the people who were ever part of Marrow Creek. And those faces will be smiling, not because they're happy, but because they're home. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have tried to escape, or would you have stayed to see it through? There were survivors. Not many, but enough to piece together what Marrow Creek actually was. In 1973, a woman named Catherine Vess came forward and identified herself as a descendant of one of the 13 families. She'd been born in Marrow Creek in 1931, but her mother had smuggled her out when she was 6 years old. Catherine's mother had been one of the younger wives, married into the Vess family at 17. And according to Catherine, her mother had realized within the first year of marriage that something was fundamentally wrong with the settlement. It wasn't just the isolation or the strange customs. It was the way people talked about time. They didn't speak about the future the way normal people did, with hope or uncertainty or plans. They spoke about it as if it had already happened, as if everything that would ever occur had been determined generations ago and they were simply moving through the motions until the appointed moment arrived. Catherine's mother noticed other things too. The way the elders kept records of everyone's dreams. The way children were paired with specific adults based on criteria that were never explained. The way certain families were only allowed to marry into certain other families, following a pattern that seemed arbitrary until you mapped it out over several generations and realized it formed a shape, a geometric design that corresponded exactly to the arrangement of the 13 houses. Catherine said her mother had drawn the pattern on paper and shown it to an old woman who'd once been a schoolteacher before joining the settlement through marriage. The old woman had looked at the drawing, gone pale, and told Catherine's mother to burn it immediately and never speak of it again. She said that the pattern was the same shape as the foundation stone, and that the foundation stone was not a foundation for anything that had been built. It was a lid, and every child born into Marrow Creek was another notch loosening that lid, another increment of pressure building beneath it. The families weren't waiting for something to happen. They were making it happen, one generation at a time. Catherine's mother fled with her daughter in the winter of 1937. They walked out on foot in the middle of the night, following the road to the nearest town 15 miles away. Catherine said her mother never told her why she chose that specific night to run. But years later, Catherine found a notation in her mother's personal journal that might explain it. October 12th, the same date, 20 years before the final disappearance. Her mother had written, "They took Samuel to the clearing tonight. He didn't come back. There's enough now. We're close." Samuel was Catherine's older brother. She'd forgotten she even had a brother until she read that entry. The memory had been so thoroughly suppressed that it took months of therapy to recover fragments of it. She remembered a boy who looked like her. She remembered him being led away by the elders one evening. And she remembered her mother screaming, and then silence. And then nothing. Just a blank space where her brother should have been. Catherine spent the rest of her life trying to find others who'd escaped. She found 3. One was a man named Thomas Rourke, who'd been sent away as a child because he'd been born with a deformity that made him ineligible for whatever role he was supposed to fulfill. Another was a woman named Ida Stroud, who'd left in 1949 after her husband died and the elders told her she'd need to remarry within the week. And the third was a man who refused to give his real name but said he'd been part of Marrow Creek until 1955, just a year before the disappearance. He said that by the end, people weren't even pretending anymore. The elders openly discussed the completion. They spoke about it with the kind of calm certainty that you'd use to talk about an upcoming harvest or a planned trip. He said the children were being prepared, taught songs in that other language, taught to walk in specific patterns around the clearing. And he said that on his last night there, he'd watched from his window as every person in the settlement, nearly 200 of them, stood in concentric circles around the foundation stone and sang until dawn. And the stone sang back. So what was Marrow Creek? The question assumes there's an answer that makes sense within our normal framework of understanding. A cult, a genetic experiment, a mass delusion that ended in mass suicide. But none of those explanations account for the physical evidence, the foundation stone that vanished without a trace, the perfect circular depression that goes down further than anyone has been willing to measure, the symbols that appear on trees within a 50-mile radius of the site, always in the same configuration, always appearing overnight. And they don't account for the children. In the decade following the disappearance, there were 17 births in the surrounding counties where the children were born speaking, not babbling, speaking, Full sentences in a language that linguists couldn't identify. The parents were terrified. Most of them gave the children up for adoption. Some of them tried to have the children institutionalized. And in every case, by the time the child reached the age of 7, they stopped speaking that language and had no memory of ever knowing it. But researchers who studied recordings of those children found something disturbing. They weren't speaking 17 different languages. They were all speaking the same language. And when the recordings were analyzed for phonetic patterns, the researchers found that the sounds matched the rhythm and cadence of the singing that witnesses had reported hearing from Marrow Creek in the weeks before the disappearance. There's a theory, though it's more of a horror than a theory. It goes like this. Marrow Creek was never a community. It was a ritual that took 195 years to complete. Every person born into those families was a syllable in a sentence that something beneath the ground had been waiting centuries to hear spoken aloud. The marriages, the births, the careful genetic interweaving of the 13 bloodlines, it was all in service of creating the exact sequence of human lives necessary to pronounce a name, or to open a door, or to fulfill a contract that had been signed long before any of them were born. And in October of 1956, the sentence was finally complete. The name was spoken, the door was opened, and Marrow Creek went home, not to a place, but to whatever had been waiting under that stone since before the Cherokee, before the settlers, before anyone had a name for the mountains or the hollows or the places where the trees grow wrong. The site is still there. The coordinates exist, though they're not published anywhere you can easily find them. People do go looking for it. Urban explorers, paranormal investigators, thrill seekers who think they're brave enough to stand at the edge of that hole and look down. Most of them can't find it. The few who do usually leave within an hour. They say the air feels too heavy. They say the silence is wrong, like the forest is holding its breath. And they say that if you stand in the clearing long enough, you start to hear something. Not the wind, not animals, but a low rhythmic sound coming from deep underground, a sound that almost resembles singing. And if you hear it, you're supposed to leave immediately, because according to the people who've heard it and made it out, the singing doesn't come from beneath the ground. It comes from inside your own head, and once you hear it, it doesn't stop. It just gets quieter or louder depending on how far you are from the clearing. Catherine Vess said that even after 70 years away from Marrow Creek, she still heard it sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet. A voice that wasn't quite her mother's and wasn't quite her own, singing in a language she'd never learned but somehow understood. And the song was always the same. It was welcoming her home, telling her that the door was still open, that there was still room in the circles beneath the stone, that the completion wasn't finished. It was just beginning. And sooner or later, everyone with Marrow Creek blood in their veins would hear the song and follow it back. Not in this life, maybe, but in the patterns their children would carry, in the dreams their descendants would have, in the way their bloodlines would arrange themselves over generations until the shape was right again, until the sentence needed another syllable. That's the real horror of Marrow Creek. It didn't end. It just went underground. And it's still growing, still waiting, still singing. Somewhere in the hills of Appalachia, beneath soil that no one will ever build on and roads that no map will ever show, something is patient. And it has all the time in the world, because time is the one thing it taught those families to understand perfectly, not as a line moving forward, but as a circle, always returning, always completing. And if you have even a trace of those 13 names in your family tree, somewhere deep in your ancestry where you've never thought to look, then you're already part of the pattern. You always have been, and sooner or later, you'll hear the song too. We all will, because Marrow Creek wasn't destroyed, it was planted, and now it's spreading.